Hi, I'm John Boyne. I'm the author of the novel A Ladder to the Sky.
Hi, I'm Richard Caudry. I'm the actor who's reading the first-person narrative, Eric Ackerman.
I'm Nina Shasonia, and I'm reading Edith Camberley, who is the wife of Maurice Camberley.
So A Ladder to the Sky is a novel very much about ambition and about manipulation. It's a story about a young man called Maurice Swift and three attachments that he makes over the course of his life. Firstly with Eric, who Richard is playing in the audio version, then with his wife Edith, and then with a young man named Theo. Eric, in the first section, is an elderly novelist who has become successful quite late in life, and Maurice attaches himself to him in the hope of building his own literary career. All he ever wants to be is a writer, and he has great talent, but what he doesn't have is any imagination. So he can't really find his own stories, so he uses other people to find his stories for him.
Not that I intended to write a memoir, certainly not. Fiction was my métier, and fiction was my comforting home. Also, it wasn't as if I could ever write a truthful autobiography. I would be vilified instantly, and one would assume arrested. No, I couldn't do anything as theatrical as that. But what I could do was write a novel. All I'd ever needed was a story, and once I'd had that, I still believed that I was one of the best in the game. And so I did what I'd been doing all my life. I started to write. I began with a boy growing up in Yorkshire who wanted to make something of himself. I kept separate files, taking the truth and recreating it exactly as I remembered it. I began with my friendship with Henry Rowe, that early conquest of mine and the first person who had made me understand the powerful draw of my beauty. It hadn't worked out, of course. I'd never managed to finish the story I was writing, but I'd been young at the time and I wasn't going to reproach myself for that. I'd still be learning after all, and Henry had proved an excellent place to start.
Chapter 6, New York. The flight to New York was the first occasion that we actually travelled together, and while on the plane we planned our itinerary. I was to give a reading at the 92nd Street Y, another as part of a panel of novelists at New York University, and a third in a Brooklyn library, along with the usual interviews, signing sessions and radio broadcasts. And Maurice agreed to accompany me to all of these, as long as he could keep one evening free to catch up with some friends who lived in the city.
I'm sure you didn't, he said. I don't think anyone would have predicted that you'd ever find a publisher, but they do say there's a boom in children's writing at the moment, don't they? And that's where the money is too, from what I understand. It's not a... began Garrett, and I could see that he was doing all he could to stop himself from roaring this at the top of his voice. I knew you were just taking the piss out of him, and I had to bite my lip to stop myself laughing. Yes, we know it's not a children's book, shouted Nicholas, throwing his arms in the air in frustration. Jesus, Garrett, why don't you just get that printed on cards and hand them out to people every time the subject comes up?
So Richard, you're saying this is your first audiobook.
Yes.
How have you found bringing Eric's voice to onto the recording?
It's extraordinary because you go into that little booth and you close the doors and it's so much more involving and more consuming than when you're at home preparing it or whatever. I find myself in the hotel with him, or in Rome or in Copenhagen with him, sitting on the bench with Maurice. I find myself falling in love with Maurice like I had done with Oscar in a wonderfully imaginative way, simply because of the material that one's working with. It seems to be, the levers are there to touch, do you know? When you describe the beauty of his black hair flopping and his skin and the smell of him. And you go, in that little world, Tottenham Court Road is out the window, and you're suddenly there.
It's vital that we get children reading, you continued. Then when the little monsters grow up, they'll read books by Edith and me and some of your colleagues here. We actually owe people like you, Garrett, a debt of gratitude. And what about you, Maurice? Asked Garrett, who was never one to back down from a fight. Will you be joining me on the festival circuit, or is that all a thing of the past for you? I don't really do children's festivals, you said. You don't really do adult festivals either anymore, do you? He asked. It's been so long since Two Germans. I know there was that other little book after that. What was it called again? The Cubbyhole? Something like that? But as far as I understand, that's best left unmentioned. When I prepare to do an audiobook, From the very first time I read it, I don't read it first and then make the notes. I make notes as I go, just in order to get the first impression. And then I read it again to amend those notes, to make sure I know what's coming up, to make sure that if somebody says, she shouted finally at the end of a page, that I haven't been shouting right at the beginning of the page, that sort of thing. To note down different characters, to note down whether they might have different voices or different accents. And then, once I'd done all that with my bit, I then read the rest of the book, both sides, to put it in context.
And do you ever read your own novels for these audiobooks? Put us actors out of work, John.
I haven't as yet, and
I wasn't suggesting you should.
No, I haven't as yet, and it's never really occurred to me to do. I mean, I'm not an actor. I quite enjoy doing the readings at events. You know,
right.
And when I start promoting a novel, I always choose one piece that I will read at every event, because then I'll get better and better at it, and you'll know where the jokes come, or where the audience maybe has a gasp or something. Right. So I find that when I'm up on a stage in front of an audience, I quite enjoy it. With the last book, The Heart's Invisible Furies, which had a lot of jokes in it, it was really good fun to perform. And I think there's some kind of frustrated actor inside me trying to get out.
Actually, my husband has just sold his latest novel, I said, stretching the truth a little, but it seemed clear that this was only a matter of weeks, if not days, away. Really? Said Garrett, his face falling a little. An actual novel or just an idea? An actual novel, you replied, smiling, full of sentences and paragraphs and chapters. Well, good for you, he replied. Are you going to tell us what it's about, or is it a state secret? I thought I'd go for something really original, you said. Animals that can't talk, like in real life. You know, no, I'm just kidding, Garrett. Don't look so annoyed. If you don't mind, I won't tell you the story right now. You can read it when it comes out if you like. I'll make sure to get my publisher to send you a copy. But let's not talk about all this right now. It's someone's birthday, yes? Shouldn't we be celebrating?
The readings themselves went well, except for the panel event, where I was teamed with a much-praised novelist from Park Slope, some 20 years my junior, who looked as if he had spent the entire day shooting a fashion commercial for a high-class designer label, and a young woman whose debut had been published 6 years earlier, but showed no sign of committing to a second book. For some reason, she insisted on calling me Herr Ackerman, despite repeated pleas on my part for her to call me Erich. I couldn't, she said backstage as she demanded a glass of wine from a volunteer. You're like old enough to be my grandfather. The woman, let's call her Susan, and the middle-aged man, we'll try Andrew, sat on either side of me on the stage, and as Susan's novel drew artificial and deeply contrived parallels between the political tensions in Germany during the 30s, American opposition to the Vietnam War some 30 years later, the moderator asked me whether I found that her writing accurately reflected my experience of the city during those days. What bits of the novel are you looking forward most to hearing?
There's a few. At the end of the first section, the moment where Eric kind of finally humiliates himself a little bit with Morris and is sort of begging him to come back to England with him, and has to just walk down that corridor and realise that this is not going to happen. I think, that's a moment that I worked really, really hard on. Certainly the Gore Vidal section that's probably my favourite part in the book. And in the last, I think just the very last couple of pages where, not to give anything away to the listener, but the last couple of pages where we see Morris at the end and how he is and how his life is, and to see what kind of tone the actor puts onto that, I think would be quite interesting.
It's so long ago that it's difficult for me to remember, I said, looking out at an audience whose attention seemed entirely focused on the younger man to my left. You must remember that I was just a teenager then, and my mind wasn't particularly concerned with politics. I was thinking about my future and hoping for a career as a writer. However, while I think Susan's book is very well researched, she certainly captures the geography of the city well. My concern would be for the lack of a moral compass among the German characters.
I've spoken to a lot of novelists about this, and almost all novelists will read their work aloud, and they want to hear it. Because eventually you do read it in front of an audience, and there is a performance element then as well. And if you have clunky language, or if you have something that doesn't sound right, the audience will hear it.
This was a considerable understatement on my part, for I had read the novel a few weeks earlier upon receiving my schedule, and found it to be not only trite in its depiction of racial conflict, but deeply naive in its thinking, while her research seemed to have been conducted exclusively from watching old Second World War movies. At even the merest hint of criticism, however, she turned to me, instantly defensive. "A moral compass," she said. "Could you clarify what you mean by that, Herr Ackerman?" "The fact is," I replied, impressed by how she could use a form of address to suggest a lack of balance on my part, "there were some Germans during those days who were quite vocal in their dissent to the policies of Hitler, and many who sought to escape the country entirely. It seems unfortunate to me that their presence is so rarely represented in war fiction." "I don't write war fiction," she said, making inverted comma signs in the air with her fingers. "Please don't compartmentalize my work." "I think you want to be very careful how you tread here, pal," said Andrew, who was sitting forward in his chair now, amusement and outrage competing for dominance in his tone. "Susan's something of an expert on that period of history." "And I actually lived it," I replied.
There was Eric and Dash and Edith, all good stories to tell. To make it easier for myself, my first draft was written exactly as I remembered things, using their real names and using my own. The plan was to write about a person with absolutely no conscience, someone who would use anyone to get ahead, an operator on the very highest level. And then, when my first draft was written, I would get down to the real work, change the names of course, and draw much wider distinctions between myself and the character's real-life counterparts. Also, I had decided that my protagonist would not be an aspiring writer, but an actor. Erich and Dash would be great men of the theatre, Edith and Ingenue, and I had a lovely idea for a section where I and my Dash recreations would spend a night at the home of Laurence Olivier and Joan Plowright, where Olivier, wily old fox that he was, would be the only person who had ever seen through me. I was certain that Gore would appreciate the comparison with perhaps the most handsome and talented actor ever to appear on screen. I had written several drafts of that section, and it was my favourite by far because I had always thought that if Gore had simply taken the time to get to know me, then we might have got along. It was a shame, I thought, that he was no longer alive to read it.